one other note, because we don't have a large group, feel free to ask questions throughout the process, throughout this webinar, and we can address them as we go. We don't have to wait till the end. We're going to cover a lot of material here very quickly, so please do interrupt me. And we're going to focus on visuals during this webinar, but I wanted to emphasize what decisions are we trying to improve. And here we're focused on what are our top risks that may affect the business, and what should we invest to operate at an acceptable level of risk. And I like this visual to help bring out, are we making implicit decisions, and how do we get to very explicit decisions on work that we should do and work that we could do. And the ultimate goal here from improving decisions from a security standpoint is, should we go faster or slower? Do we need more or less of security? And I like this visual to help bring that out and set the stage for folks. Now, as far as some of the visuals that we're going to walk through, I use them really as a way to tell a theme or tell a story. These are the top stories we're going to cover briefly today. When it comes to prioritizing risk and spend, it's always good to give an update from the previous year. What are the current risks that we're tracking, and what is their disposition, and what should we do to spend to mitigate these to an acceptable level, and what is the benefit we're going to get from this type of spending, and finally, how does that spending compare and these risk priorities compare to our operating performance across the organization. And we'll do that through target-based metrics. And I am kind of a process nut, so I put in one slide here because I want to emphasize, while we can have pretty pictures and we have evidence to back those stories and help communicate and make those decisions, there is a lot of work that goes into these visuals. So there's a formal process really needs to support it. So this is just my pitch for every action that it takes to build these visuals, to have that swim lane, as far as who collects data, who defines targets, who collects evidence, who makes treatment decisions. A lot of times there's some ambiguity there for the security team. We might have accountability for facilitating risk decisions, but they don't have accountability for specific treatment decisions themselves. So for every action, who's responsible and accountable, who contributes or who's informed on these decisions? It's really powerful. And the second piece, whenever we're talking about risk, we have to include some specific evidence to drive how bad things happen and why we should care. And this is what I call our little pyramid of evidence. So before we put something on that heat map, we better have some evidence, and hopefully it comes from sources that we can control, from our intelligence services, our attack and pen assessments, our control metrics, versus that information that is all too actionable from incidents and root cause analysis. All right, with that said, let's introduce our first visual. This is just a classic heat map of impact over likelihood. And from the progress from last year, I'd like to use the vector approach. So how has the heat map moved from the previous time that we met? So I'd like to incorporate the status of that risk overlaid on the heat map. So in this case, we've got some risks that we've decided to accept. The risk was acceptable, considering the control spend, things that were in process of mitigating, and the things and potential projects that we've completed, say, over the last year. And also, as I mentioned, there's a lot of work that goes behind these heat maps, and we'll talk about this later in if we have time from the appendix side. There's a lot of calibration that goes to, is the audience familiar with what are these scale definitions? So is it clear what are the quantitative and qualitative stories behind a 6 versus a 9? What are the annualized frequencies in the likelihood scale from a red versus an orange? There's a lot of assumptions here that groundwork has been performed, but this presentation really just focuses on what visuals and how do we tell those stories. So the theme that you'll see throughout this webinar is we'll have a visual on the right that really draws the eye to the key points. And then on the left, we'll have supporting stories. And I like to keep these almost limited just to the titles. And then depending on the flow and the questions in the meeting, I'll have all my evidence and the detailed reports so we can talk about the impact and likelihood for each of these work efforts. So a very clean presentation, but you have to have that supporting evidence to withstand the scrutiny, especially as we talk about future risks. So when it comes to areas that we're concerned about now, where we're going to be driving treatment decisions, I like to use a similar heat map and the risk status. So here we can talk about things that we're currently developing treatment decisions for, areas that we're working on now, and a story that really highlighted over the last couple of years is to be more transparent about areas that we don't have sufficient evidence to make a solid impact or likelihood estimate yet. And in this area of evidence needed, or sometimes we'll use even a weaker status of just risks that we're watching or trending, it can be really helpful when we go into the budgeting process to justify, we need some projects to collect evidence in this, either internally or bring in some external help and validate that. An alternative view to the classic heat map, for those shops that have reached the next stage of maturity and have starting to quantify the impacts for these risk estimates, I prefer the error bar approach, where you can have the most likely impact, and then you get a sense for what is the best and worst case for these impact areas. And when you reach this level of maturity, the best practice that we use is to make sure that the risk owner and the affected asset owners, they're the ones that are accountable for really driving these impact estimates. The security team is responsible for facilitating that and making sure all of the short-term and long-term direct and indirect costs are incorporated. But when it comes to making decisions on this, to make sure that the actual business owner is participating in driving that range. But as we move from the risk prioritization conversation into, all right, so what? Where should we start to invest? And interestingly enough, I see more debate and churn and disagreement over the investment and spending packages than I do in the risk priorities. In the security community echo chamber, we tend to debate most on risk priorities and evidence to justify those estimates, but in practice, I see most of the discussion here. So this is a visual that we use to try and facilitate that debate. So we have a scale of what we call business value, and this is a similar scale for the risk ranking. And that business value is just a simple average of the risk reduction that we estimate, as well as and incorporate the business value and IT capability. So a lot of times politics will really drive spending decisions. So maybe the money has already been allocated, or there's a commitment that's been made. Maybe there's just an efficiency save instead of a specific risk reduction. Maybe there's just a compliance requirement that may not address a business risk, but we just have to do it. We incorporate those stories into the business value, and it's a nice way that we can document that for posterity when we come back. The other benefit of this visual, we use the blue dots to show which areas that are included in this spending package. And the other work efforts, we leave the dots with the highest risks associated with it. So we really want to be explicit and say, these are the areas that we're investing, say in AppSec and access management, and these are the areas we're not addressing. These are the risks that we will be accepting until we go through the next prioritization exercise. And I also forgot to mention earlier, I built all these heat maps and impact scales and project plots in Excel as a practitioner. These are all generated through our risk communicator tool, which really provides some consistency in the workflow and automated outputs. But it's not necessary. A spreadsheet can still facilitate this. GRC platforms can be used to provide a lot of the data, and depending on that platform, some of the visuals too. So there's nothing prohibiting except time maybe to produce these visuals on your own. And it's my dramatic pause for questions. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next one. So after that conversation, here's another story that might resonate with folks. So given that spending package, what are the risk reduction benefits that we're going to see? Maybe we've already talked about some efficiency or other alternative benefits, but this is how we think the risk map is going to change the next time we talk. So this is another kind of before and after picture. So we use the vectors on the heat map again. And some key stories here are we going to be partially done, or do we think we're going to be at a point where this risk is an acceptable level? And that can be a real powerful message for multi-year initiatives to set expectations that, hey, but when it comes to risks around endpoint management and malware and awareness and monitoring, or our ability to detect and recover from an incident, these are going to be ongoing. We're not going to be done yet. This is an alternative view. I recently was working with a customer who was a bit more averse to the heat maps just from overuse. So what we did here is we just have a stack plot of the types of risks, and we grouped them by the business drivers that were we used that same terminology that resonated in their board of directors. So when it comes to complying with regulations or productivity, growing revenue, etc., we were able to associate and lead with that story, and then say, here's the risk associated with that, and here's the evidence that we have to prioritize this based off our calibrated ranges. Another way to communicate that, if you are a heat map hugger, is we can have that same story around business drivers, but then group those risks and place that group on the heat map. So we do have high risks associated with our drivers of complying with regulations and productivity and availability, for example. Or here's where the risks are that are associated with our brand. So the complement then is for what's driving these risks and how is our operating environment performance. This is where we like to bring in the metrics conversation. So when the risk estimates are great to prepare for the future, make sure we're managing risk to an acceptable level. Here's where we can talk about actual performance. So the key for us when we help folks set up metrics programs, that every metric has a target. So you have an actual value and a target value. This allows us to do these roll-ups. So here we have groups of metrics over on the left, and the top, this is just a weighted average, averaging the difference from expected progress. So how far is our actual versus the target that we've defined? So in this example, you can see the green line is the target, and over the last couple months we fell below that threshold, and we're starting to come back up. So there's a story there, and the visuals can help communicate that. So say, for example, in our application space, why is this red? And then we can use that. So this is the top view, and then if there's a story there, we can drill down. So let's focus on application security and look at its history. And I pulled this example because there's another powerful thing with targets. They don't have to be static. These targets can change over time. For example, in this area, there was a lot of post-production vulnerabilities earlier in the year. Then there was some investment to address them. The control owners there raised that target. That's the acceptable level that they wanted. And then there was a huge drop-off. So what happened? And are we stabilizing now? So whatever that story is, we can use this history plot to communicate that and let people know where we are. And that ability to go from my very overall top view, and there's one or two stories that are impactful, drill down on them, that's real powerful from a leadership standpoint on the metrics visuals. And those are the visuals key visuals that we use to improve decisions on for risk and metrics. Whenever I talk about these concepts, I also like to help promote one of my favorite Dan Gear articles, Measure Like You Meant It. If you haven't checked that out, please take the time. And with that, here's my contact information, and let's open it up for questions. Any questions, Melissa?
We do have a question. How can you quickly change the trend maps if they're spending or making spending decisions in the meeting?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is one area where it's helpful to have a tool. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. So changing the visual is one aspect, but we need to understand which axes we're going to change. So it kind of goes back to the evidence. You can, if this is a discrete object, you can just change it here, but more importantly, what aspect of the risks statement are we changing? So what I was going to show you afterward is what we use to break down a risk statement. So for background, this is from, we use the NIST 830 as a guide. Some of these are summarized. But to identify which area we're changing on, the impact or likelihood, or is something changed on the threat agent environment or an attribute of the vulnerability. So that's the first point, is what are we changing and why? And then when we do change it, to be able to, in our tool, for example, is find that attribute and then modify it. So we think that there's going to be, the reputation loss is going to be significant, or maybe it's going to be worse, and then to be able to document that. So that's the real key, is the visual is one aspect, but to identify where in the risk statement is going to be the change. Did I answer that question correct, sufficiently?
It looks like it. Let's see, we do have another question too. You might have addressed this a little bit, but how did you come up with the impact and likelihood estimates?
Yeah, that's a great question. Then it really goes back to the process elements on is the security team working with the right people to understand the business impacts. So when you present a threat scenario of X type of actor or a criminal, say, taking this data and that breach goes public, what does that mean to the business? Or when that system is out for a specific period of time or defaced, what is this going to mean to the business? And to walk that business owner through all the different aspects of the impact area and quantifying those when we can, and then identifying the qualitative scales. So the kind of getting back into this tool, we use the heat map to help drive that. So is this type of loss, is this going to be an action that is not acceptable to that control owner? Is our recovery process sufficient to, this would just be an interim blip. Maybe we'll miss a quarterly revenue target, but it's not going to be a material impact. Or hey, we can recover from this. And it was to walk that business decision through those three criteria of, wow, this could be this could affect my career. It could material affect our performance. It might just be a quarter blip, or we can recover. So that's those. I like to take those three scales and work with the business owner and go through the different categories and quantify those as well as qualify them. And on a related note, earlier I just kind of glossed over that, hey, you're using a heat map and it has these scales. It's really important to, I just use the word calibrate here, to make sure that the stakeholders understand, what is a 6 or what is a 10, and have examples, to have your revenue ranges, at a ratio scale, preferably. So, the dollar value from a 2 to a 3 is similar to a 7 to an 8. Another option here, another point is to make sure that these scales align to other scales that might be defined within the organization. So in a lot of federated or larger shops, they'll have an enterprise risk management function to ensure that maybe they use a 3x3 or 5x5, whatever it is that those definitions are aligned. Good question. And it really reinforces there's a lot of work behind the eye candy to tell a story. Oh, I forgot one point, and it's not in the slide deck. Another powerful visual that's in a related slide deck, it's the kill chain visual. So risk estimates are great. You have your documented evidence behind each of these risk titles here. But even at an executive level or decision-making level, I found that just a kill chain summary is really, really powerful. It kind of personalizes these risks. Like, what do you mean device malware or e-commerce breach? Just to have the standard kill chain workflow of reconnaissance and delivery, exploitation, escalation, exfiltration, cover-up. And when you have real evidence in those stages or show where you need to get more evidence, that can be very powerful. And it's a technique that our assessment team uses very effectively as well. We were able to mirror this type of threat agent and accomplish this action based off this kill chain. And wow, when you have that little timeline summary, it really brings these little dots on Heatmap to life. All right, that's all I have.
Perfect.
Did that bring up any other questions, Melissa? Otherwise, we're just at our half hour.
I don't see any other questions, so as long as no one has anything last minute, I think we're good.
All right, thanks everyone for attending, and feel free to reach out and engage us afterward.